Okay, AMP1 students, we're going to continue on talking about the autonomic nervous system. So we are currently starting in this video on the differences between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. So the first difference that we're going to talk about has to do with where that preganglionic motor neuron, where it's originating from, like what location of the central nervous system is it extending from. So in our pictures, this is the picture for the parasympathetic system. And so you will notice that, remember the brown, they colored them brown, these motor neurons are called the preganglionic motor neurons. So you can look here and see where they're originating. So we have from the CNS, we have our brain here and our spinal cord. So you can see that they're originating from the brainstem here, the cranium area. And then we have to slide down here. And then the sacral region of the spinal cord is where the other preganglionic motor neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system are originating from. So that's where they're located. You'll notice that we don't have any anywhere else along the spinal cord. So they will call, sometimes you'll hear them refer to this system, the parasympathetic, as the craniosacral division, just because of where the preganglionic motor neurons are located, or where their cell bodies are located, where they're originating from. All right, so then the sympathetic is different. If you look at that, you'll notice that, so remember the brown are our preganglionic motor neurons. There, so we can see a little bit more of them here. Oops, I'm messing this up. So you'll notice, I guess we'll show you, you notice there's none coming off of the brainstem. There's none coming off of the sacral region of the spinal cord. So the rest of them are coming off of and extending off of our thoracic region of our spinal cord and then our lumbar region. So that's where those preganglionic motor neurons are originating from, is from that area. So in that case, this is the sympathetic, and so another common name for that would be thoraco, which is a prefix for thoracic, and then lumbar, so thoracolumbar. And so that is the location of those preganglionic neuron, the cell bodies of those. All right, so that's one anatomical difference between those two systems. And the next anatomical difference has to do with the length of the preganglionic motor neurons and the ganglionic or postganglionic motor neurons. So in our pictures, we'll go back to our parasympathetic. So remember, the preganglionic are the brown, and then the postganglionic or the ganglionic are the green. So what we have with the parasympathetic is these preganglionic motor neurons are much longer than if we look at our sympathetic. Move down a little bit. If we look at our sympathetic preganglionic motor neurons, they're much shorter. So when we talk about the difference in lengths of those preganglionic motor neurons, the parasympathetic has the longer preganglionic motor neurons, and the sympathetic has the shorter ones. And then when we look at our ganglionic motor neurons, so in this case they're green, these are relatively shorter than the preganglionic ones. So these are shorter, but if you look at our sympathetic, you will notice that the preganglionics are short, but the postganglionic motor neurons are relatively long. So when we're looking at our motor neurons that are taking the signals from the CNS out to the various effector organs, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands, the parasympathetic has short preganglionic motor neurons, the parasympathetic has long preganglionic motor neurons and shorter postganglionic motor neurons. And then the sympathetic is just opposite. It has the shorter preganglionic motor neurons and the longer postganglionic motor neurons. So that is our second anatomical difference. And then our third anatomical difference is the location of the ganglion. So, and you can kind of guess the location of the ganglion based on the length of the pre- and postganglionic motor neurons. So if we look at we'll go back to our parasympathetic. Remember, these are the ganglion, and there's ganglion there. So these autonomic ganglion for the parasympathetic nervous system, they're relatively close to the effectors. So this is closer to salivary glands. And then, or they're actually, some of them are so close to the effector organs, they're actually like in the wall of the effector organs. So in this case, for these two. So because they have those longer preganglionic motor neurons, their autonomic ganglion is usually closer to the effector organs. So the cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and glands. And then that's opposite for our sympathetic nervous system. Since we have those short preganglionic motor neurons, the autonomic ganglion are very close, almost adjacent to our spinal cord. So they're relatively close to the spinal cord and farther away from the effector organs, which are the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Okay, so that was our third anatomical difference between those two systems. So the next thing that we'll talk about is the differences in the neurotransmitters. So we talked about neurotransmitters. Specifically, we talked about acetylcholine and how that neurotransmitter, it's part of the somatic motor neurons. It's released from somatic motor neurons that innervate or provide nerve signals to skeletal muscle. So that's acetylcholine neurotransmitter. So we do have acetylcholine that is a neurotransmitter of some of these autonomic motor neurons, but we have another neurotransmitter too that we need to be familiar with. So the two neurotransmitters that you'll find communicating at chemical synapses with between the neurons is acetylcholine, and then the other one is called norepinephrine. So norepinephrine. Sometimes it's abbreviated NE as well. So you need to know those two neurotransmitters, but then you need to know like where they are located. So which neurons, whether it's the preganglionic motor neurons or the postganglionic motor neurons that release those particular neurotransmitters. Okay, so if we're talking about acetylcholine, if we look at both of the parasympathetic and sympathetic motor neurons, we'll see that all of the preganglionic motor neurons are going to produce and release the acetylcholine. So that means that at these ganglion, these guys, preganglionic motor neurons, this is the sympathetic nervous system, they're going to release acetylcholine here. And then parasympathetic, so here and here, that'll be acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is a big neurotransmitter in the autonomic nervous system, and it's being released at by the preganglionic motor neurons for both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic motor neurons. All right, and then if we look at our postganglionic motor neurons, if we just look at those that are part of the parasympathetic nervous system, so just these, they all will release acetylcholine as well. So you could say for the parasympathetic motor neurons, acetylcholine is their neurotransmitter because it's going to be released from the preganglionic motor neurons and the postganglionic ones. So it's acetylcholine for the parasympathetic motor neurons. Okay, so then for the sympathetic, it was acetylcholine here for the preganglionic motor neurons. But then when it comes to the postganglionic motor neurons, there's going to be some differences. So there are a few sympathetic postganglionic motor neurons that may release acetylcholine, but many of them are going, and I won't ask you which ones release acetylcholine, but I want you to know many of them are going to release norepinephrine, those postganglionic ones. So if we're looking at the sympathetic nervous system, and we're looking at neurotransmitters, the preganglionic motor neurons release acetylcholine, and then the postganglionic motor neurons release norepinephrine in general. Majority of them do. So those are the two neurotransmitters for our sympathetic. Acetylcholine here, and then norepinephrine here at the postganglionic ones. All right. All right, and then the next thing that we'll talk about, which we haven't talked in a lot of detail about, receptors. We've talked about acetylcholine receptors, I suppose, so we've talked about those, but we haven't talked about the names of the receptors, that specific names, because there's different types of receptors, just like there's different types of neurons. So we're going to get into a little bit of the types of receptors. So when we, one thing you need to know is when we have a neuron that releases acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter, we call all those neurons, they have like kind of the general name called cholinergic neurons, because they're releasing acetylcholine, so the choline part's in the word here. So we'd say they're cholinergic neurons, so because they release the acetylcholine. So we, all the preganglionic motor neurons are cholinergic neurons. Some of the, so anyway, we won't go into, so they're called cholinergic if they release acetylcholine. So now so remember this acetylcholine is being released from axon terminals, and then that chemical, acetylcholine, will travel across that synaptic cleft and bind to receptors on the next cell's membrane. So we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, so it'd be like on the surface of a cardiac muscle cell or a smooth muscle cell, or a gland cell too. So it depends on what receptor is on that membrane of the effector organ. So we could have two types of receptors that acetylcholine can bind to. So the first one's called nicotinic. And so if acetylcholine binds to a nicotinic receptor on the surface of the effector organ, whether it's cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands, it always produces a graded potential that'll turn into an action potential. So it's always excitatory. So you always get an excitatory postsynaptic potential and then an action potential down the neuron if it's nicotinic. The other type of acetylcholine receptor is called a muscarinic receptor. So acetylcholine could bind to the muscarinic receptors, and there's different types of muscarinic receptors, which we're not going to go into the different types of those. We can go down a rabbit hole if we do that, but just realize that it just kind of depends on the type. And so if acetylcholine binds to these, you could inhibit that effector organ, or you could stimulate it too, so excite it. So we could kind of go either way with those. But definitely remember that the cholinergic neurons produce acetylcholine, and the two types of cholinergic receptors that acetylcholine can bind to are nicotinic and muscarinic. All right. And then the last type of receptors. So remember we have norepinephrine. We're kind of introducing a new neurotransmitter that we haven't talked about before. So there are any of the neurons that release norepinephrine, produce and release norepinephrine as their neurotransmitter. They're called adrenergic neurons. So these are adrenergic neurons. And just like the cholinergic neurons, when they get released from the adrenergic neurons at the axon terminals of those, and they go across the synaptic cleft, they could bind to an alpha receptor or a beta receptor. So again, it'll depend, and then these guys, alpha receptors and beta receptor, just like muscarinic, have like subclasses. There's like alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2. We're not going to go into those details, but just realize that alpha receptors and beta receptors are what the norepinephrine could bind to. And depending on which one they bind to, you'll either get a stimulate, excitatory, excite that effector organ, or again, kind of depends on the receptor type. You might stimulate it or inhibit it. So